Hi class, this week we will be discussing the topic of retrieval practice in learning. Specifically, we will discuss the first paper of this week's reading. This paper argues that retrieval practice would produce more learning than elaborative studying. Historically, when promoting learning, education has relied heavily on elaborative study, which promote knowledge encoding, while it very less frequently used the method of retrieving and reconstructing knowledge to promote learning. Historically, it is assumed that learning happens primarily when people encode knowledge into the memory. And retrieving knowledge from memory is usually itself not considered learning. As a result, there are a few limits in the previous research. Most education research and practice focus a lot on enhancing the processing that occurs when students encode knowledge, and they focus less on potential importance of retrieval to the process of learning. Most of the previous research are under verbal learning context, which does not reflect the complex information learned in actual education settings. Also, they were not using assessment style to measure meaningful learning, which is the ability to make inference and the ability to exhibit deep understanding of concepts. This historical context brings up a research question. Does retrieval practice produce same level of learning as elaborative studying? Could retrieval practice do even better than elaborative study on promoting learning? The argument of this research is that not only does retrieval produce learning, but a retrieval event can actually represent a more powerful learning activity than an encoding event. There are two experiments in this research. In the first experiment, they recruited 80 undergraduate students, and the students were firstly asked to do one single initial learning session, and they were put into 4 groups to learn knowledge differently under 4 different controlled conditions. Then they were all asked to self-assess how well they think they learned in those sessions, and they will also assess how well they will remember this knowledge. Then after 1 week, they were asked to answer a test to assess really how well they remember the knowledge after 1 week. We will introduce the different groups and control conditions. In group 1, students study the text once in a single study period. In group 2, in contrast, they study the text repeatedly in 4 consecutive periods. The group 3 represents elaborative studying using concept mapping. Concept mapping is the act of creating a diagram in which nodes are used to represent concepts, and the links are connecting the nodes or the concepts, which represents the relationship among the concepts. Concept mapping is usually considered an active learning task and an elaborative study activity. Specifically, in this group, students studied the text in an initial study period and then created a concept map of the concept they learned in the text. This is a typical method of using concept mapping to create an elaborative study activity. The group 4 represents retrieval practice group. So students study the text in an initial study period. Then they practice retrieval by recalling as much of the information as they could on a free recall test. After recalling once, the students are asked to restudy the text and recall 1 more time. Note that the group 4 had exact same learning time as group 3, and the ideas recalled in group 4 is nearly identical proportionally to ideas produced by group 3. So that means they were spending the same amount of time and they learned the same amount of knowledge relatively. To recap, we have introduced the 4 groups. The group 1 is study once group. Group 2 is repeated study group. Group 3, elaborative concept mapping group. And group 4 is retrieval practice group. We will then talk about the self-judgments of learning. Self-judgment learning means right after the learning session, students were asked to predict the percentage of information from the text they will remember in 1 week. And the purpose is to assess students' metacognitive knowledge of the effectiveness of these learning activities. Then students were asked to answer a test after 1 week. So 1 week later, they will complete the final short answer test, which includes both verbal question and inference question. Both two types of questions are conceptual, and the two types of questions assess different depths of conceptual knowledge. Here's the result of the experiment for the verbal question, the inference question, and the student's self-judgment score. Notice that on both the verbal question and inference question, study ones performed the worst, and all other groups perform a lot better than this one. Also notice that retrieval practice performs better than conceptual mapping on both the questions in the test. Retrieval practice actually indicates a 50% improvement in long-term retention scores. Elaborative studying through concept mapping actually did not do better than repeated learning on the final test on both kinds of questions. When students self-assess their learning outcomes, they saw that repeated learning performs the best and retrieval practice performs the worst, whereas in reality, retrieval practice has always done better than repeated study in the test.
Hi everyone, my name is Maham, and I'll be continuing the discussion by discussing the second experiment followed by the conclusion. Now, if you're anything like me, then maybe you were wondering while reading the first experiment, hey, wait a minute, this seems a little biased. First, only one text for all the students, that doesn't seem very versatile. How can we generalize the study when only one piece of text was considered? It is proven that under some circumstances, the effectiveness of different learning activities can depend on the structure of the materials that students are given to learn. Secondly, how can we be sure that the students in the retrieval practice condition weren't just students with great memory retaining abilities? Maybe it had nothing to do with the learning method itself. Thirdly, it is important to note that the initial learning of the retrieval practice consisted of initial retrieval practice task, which is much similar to the final short answer final test that the students were given. It was much similar than the initial concept mapping task, at least. In experiment 2, all of these biases are discussed by extending the first experiment. So the first experiment is extended in 3 ways. We'll go over these extensions one by one. First, they added versatility to the structure of text that was being learned. 2 types of text were used. The first were texts with enumeration structures, which describes a list of concepts. So the example that was given in the study was a text describing properties of different muscle tissues. The second text were texts with sequence structures. So this essentially means that they describe a continuous and ordered series of events. So for example, a text describing the sequence of events involved in the process of digestion. Through this, the authors sought to generalize the results over texts and were found in science education. So now we have that generalization in the experiment. So the second extension I'll explain by going over the process of experiment 2. So experiment 2 considered 120 students instead of the 80 that were used in the first experiment. Each student was given 2 science texts. They created a concept map of one of the science texts and practiced retrieval on the other. The initial learning time was matched just as in experiment 1. This was done to introduce individuality to the experiment and determine the robustness of the retrieval practice effect. So moving on to the third extension. The third extension assessed long-term learning with 2 different final test formats. So the 120 students were divided such that half were given the final short answer test just as in experiment 1, while the other half took a final test in which they created concept maps of the 2 texts. And this was essentially done without them viewing the text. So this was how they made it different from the first initial concept mapping that they did. So they weren't allowed to see the text, and that's how they attempted this paper. So in theory, if retrieval practice actually helps students retain knowledge over the term, then it should produce better performance even when the final test involves creating concept map. Because remember, they're not viewing the old text, they're recalling from memory. So these were actually the results that were seen as well. As you can see here, retrieval practice produced better performance than elaborative concept mapping for both types of science text. The results were collapsed across two different text formats. The advantage of retrieval practice was seen, again, very largely. Even on the final concept mapping test, even though one would assume that due to similarity with the initial learning of the concept mapping, it would produce better results, we saw that retrieval practice dominated in terms of performance. In terms of students exhibiting metacognitive knowledge, it was observed that in general, students wrongly predicted that elaborative concept mapping would produce better long-term learning results than retrieval practice. Additionally, the effectiveness of retrieval practice was examined for each individual learner. Overall, 48% students performed better after practicing retrieval, while 75% actually believed that concept mapping would be just as effective, if not more. So let's just conclude what we've studied in the past few minutes. So first of all, retrieval practice proved to be much more effective than elaborative studying, and it proved to have meaningful, long-lasting learning results. Furthermore, it is important to note that even elaborative methods can constitute as retrieval practice, such as concept mapping when we do it in the absence of materials. Moreover, this study proves that a specific nature of activity determines the degree and quality of learning, and not just seeing if the activity constitutes as active learning. So both elaborative and retrieval practice are active learnings, but as we've just seen, the retrieval practice is much better. In understanding the theory of these results, the study explains that while elaboration involves adding more details or connections to the information, retrieval practice operates differently. Instead of adding more information, it focuses on making cues used for recalling more effectively. So think of it like this. If you're trying to remember someone's name, you might use cues like where you met them or what they looked like. Retrieval practice helps sharpen these cues so they're more effective at triggering the memory you're trying to recall. So rather than piling on more details during elaboration, retrieval practice helps by fine-tuning those cues you use to access the information stored in your memory. So it improves the effectiveness of these cues, and henceforth you can efficiently retrieve the information you've learned, which ultimately aids in the learning process. Additionally, it also involves reconstructing knowledge, which enhances learning. So in conclusion, understanding retrieval process can lead to the design of more effective educational activities. This is also part of a discussion question that we have, just to recognize where we can use this retrieval learning practice to better our own education systems. So this leads us to the end of this video. For next steps, you're encouraged to share your thoughts on Discord and join the discussion through discussion questions or anything else you'd like to share. Thanks for listening.